What if I told you there was once a king so grotesquely deformed that his own people whispered he was cursed by the devil himself? They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. His face was an uncanny mask, his jaw so misshapen that speaking and eating were constant struggles. Yet, this man was not a creature of folklore or horror fiction. He was the ruler of one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known. This is not simply the story of a man, it is the tale of a dynasty that poisoned itself in the name of power. And when he died, the autopsy revealed horrors that seemed to confirm every whisper of the supernatural. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear will make you question whether the real curse was in the blood or in the crown itself. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661 into the glittering, gold-laden Habsburg dynasty, a family that had ruled over vast territories stretching across Europe and the Americas. But the splendor of their empire hid a secret rot. For generations they had married their cousins, uncles to nieces, even uncles to great-nieces, in a desperate attempt to keep power pure within the bloodline. This strategy did not preserve the strength, it concentrated weakness. Charles was the final, tragic product of that experiment, a living warning written in flesh. From the moment of his birth, midwives knew something was wrong. His head was unusually large, his jaw protruded, and his tongue was so oversized that feeding was almost impossible. As an infant, he struggled to breathe and could barely hold himself upright. Whispers began immediately. Perhaps the devil had marked him. Perhaps he was paying for the sins of his ancestors. But the truth was more terrifying. He was paying for their obsession with absolute control. In the royal court, appearances were everything, and Charles's appearance was a political liability. The palace artists tasked with creating portraits of the young king painted him in flattering light, softening the jawline, disguising the slack muscles. But behind the brushstrokes was a boy whose health was fragile, and whose mind was often described as slow by courtiers too polite to say more. Even his tutors admitted he could barely read or write at an age when other noble children were already debating theology. The court physicians prescribed an endless series of bizarre treatments, herbal infusions, bleeding, and even powdered skulls mixed into wine. None of it worked. His legs remained weak, his speech slurred, and illnesses struck him like storms. Every fever was a threat to the succession. Every cough sent his advisors into a panic. And yet, despite his obvious frailty, the kingdom's survival depended on him producing an heir. As a child, Charles was shielded from the harsh realities of his own condition. The palace halls were filled with tapestries and gold, masking the fact that behind the walls, Spain was bleeding wealth through endless wars and political corruption. Every decision about the boy king's upbringing was not about his happiness or education, it was about keeping the illusion of stability alive for the public and foreign courts. His mother, Mariana of Austria, acted as regent and wielded real power while her son was still a minor. But even she could not ignore the constant pressure from foreign ambassadors who saw Charles's weakness as an opportunity. Rumors circulated that the young king was infertile, incapable of even consummating a marriage. In an age when a monarch's worth was measured in heirs, this was as dangerous as any enemy army. When Charles was 18, he was married to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a young French princess. The wedding was a spectacle of jewels, silk, and music designed to reassure the world that the Habsburg dynasty was strong. But behind closed doors, the truth was humiliating. The marriage remained childless, and whispers in the court grew louder, blaming the queen at first, until physicians admitted the problem might lie with the king himself. Marie-Louise reportedly adored Charles, despite his condition, but the pressure on her was unbearable. She faced the scorn of courtiers who accused her of failing in her duty to produce an heir. The young queen's health deteriorated under the weight of stress, and she died suddenly at just 26. Whispers of poison rippled through Madrid, but no proof was ever found. Her death left Charles even more isolated, a king without a queen, and a dynasty without a future. By the time Charles married again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, his health had declined further. He suffered seizures, crippling weakness, and mysterious pains that no doctor could explain. His second marriage also remained childless, and the rumors of a supernatural curse returned with new intensity. Priests were called to perform exorcisms in the palace. Holy relics were placed under his bed. But the real demon was one that no prayer could banish, the centuries-old genetic trap set by his own ancestors. By his mid-30s, Charles II looked decades older. His skin was pale and waxy, his lips often blue, and his eyes carried the dull glaze of a man permanently exhausted. He could no longer chew solid food without pain. Meals had to be mashed and softened. The royal tailors struggled to disguise his skeletal frame beneath layers of embroidered fabric. Every public appearance became a test of endurance, both for the king and for those watching who could not help but notice the fragility of their ruler. Spain's enemies watched closely. The French court mocked him behind closed doors. Foreign diplomats wrote in private letters that the king's death was not a question of if, but when. With no heir in sight, European powers began quietly maneuvering for the inevitable war over his succession. The Spanish crown, once feared, had become a pawn in a larger geopolitical game, all while Charles sat on his gilded throne, unaware of just how many vultures circled overhead. Inside the palace, fear drove every decision. Advisors argued over whether to publicly admit the king's declining health or maintain the illusion of strength. Priests performed endless masses, candles burned day and night, and astrologers were summoned to chart the stars for signs of hope. One such astrologer reportedly told Mariana of Austria that her son's birth chart was twisted beyond mortal repair, a verdict that only deepened the sense of fatalism in the court. The weight of the Habsburg legacy pressed heavily on Charles's frail shoulders. For generations, his ancestors had been portrayed as God's chosen rulers, ordained to govern with divine authority. But now, that divine image was cracking. To the common people, the king's deformities were not just a personal misfortune. They were a sign that the dynasty had lost God's favor. In an age where superstition and politics were intertwined, this was a dangerous belief to spread. In an attempt to secure an heir, Charles submitted to bizarre medical rituals. One physician ordered him to drink potions made from pulverized gemstones. Another recommended bathing in the blood of healthy young animals, claiming it would transfer vitality. Court rumor even whispered that certain priests encouraged the consumption of blessed human bone powder stolen from the relics of saints. Each treatment failed, leaving the king weaker than before. Maria Anna of Neuburg, his second wife, quickly realized that her position was precarious. Without a child, her influence in court was fragile. She began forming her own network of allies, many of whom believed Charles's death was inevitable, and sought to position her as the power behind the regency that would follow. The palace became a nest of intrigue, with factions spying, bribing, and spreading rumors in a desperate race to control the future. Meanwhile, the king's health entered a rapid downward spiral. He suffered constant digestive problems, frequent nosebleeds, and episodes of delirium in which he claimed to see spirits in his chambers. Servants whispered that he was haunted not only by the ghosts of his ancestors, but by the hundreds who had died in wars fought in his name. Some claimed they heard him muttering prayers in the dead of night, asking for release from his own body. By 1698, it was clear to everyone, except perhaps Charles himself, that his reign was nearing its end. His physicians, desperate to save him, turned again to exorcism. Monks recited incantations over his bed, sprinkling holy water across his fevered skin. According to one account, Charles trembled violently during these rites, his eyes rolling back as if something deep within him resisted. The ceremony ended with the declaration that he was free of demonic influence, yet his health continued to decline. Outside the palace, the people of Madrid alternated between pity and contempt. Some saw Charles as a tragic victim of royal arrogance, a man trapped by the decisions of generations before him. Others mocked him as a cursed king, whose body mirrored the decay of the Spanish Empire itself. Either way, his image, gaunt, frail, and sorrowful, had become the living symbol of a dynasty on the brink of collapse. As war drums echoed faintly from across Europe, the king's final months unfolded like a slow funeral procession. His legs could barely carry him from one chamber to another. His meals were reduced to broths and sweetened wine, and even these he could only consume in small amounts. Yet still the question of his successor remained unanswered, a question that would ignite one of the bloodiest succession wars in European history. And when Charles II finally breathed his last, the truth revealed by his autopsy would shock the world. The night before his death, the palace fell into a hush so complete that even servants padded barefoot across the stone to keep from disturbing the air. Candles guttered, and the confessor lingered at the bed's edge as Charles drifted in and out of consciousness, clutching a rosary with fingers gone thin and bluish, while courtiers waited in antechambers, faces tight with the knowledge that the moment his chest stilled, Europe would explode into bargaining threats and war. At dawn, the bell of the royal chapel tolled not a peal, but a low, wounded moan, and the message moved through Madrid like a cold wind. The king was dead. In the chamber, windows were thrown open to let the soul escape. Sheets were sprinkled with holy water, and a clerk, already poised with pen and sand, began the first lines of the official record that would claim dignity where the body had offered only ruin. What followed became legend. Physicians and clerics gathered for the examination, not merely to confirm death, but to make sense of it. And as they opened the royal remains, they wrote phrases that read like a medieval confession: organs shrunken beyond expectation, fluids, where none should be, a body that seemed ravaged by a lifetime of fevers and failures enough to convince a superstitious age that the whispers of sorcery might have been true all along, when in truth it was lineage itself that had written this verdict. The report, copied and recopied in dim scriptoria, traveled faster than any army. Ambassadors carried it in sealed packets. Pamphleteers paraphrased it for hungry crowds, and in taverns men raised cups not to the king's memory, but to the confirmation of what they had always suspected, that Spain's crown had been held up by a ghost whose flesh only pretended at life. Inside the council chambers, the map of Europe was resketched with ruthless clarity. French claims squared off against Austrian rights treaties were unfolded like knives, and every sentence about piety or law cloaked naked appetite. What Charles left behind was not a legacy of policy, but the detonator for the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict born from a single fragile body, and the empires eager to inherit its last breath. But to understand how a corpse could start a war, we must return to the living court in his final years, where whispers served as currency. A queen maneuvered for influence with the precision of a fencer. Confessors guarded secrets like fortresses, and the king bewildered yet stubborn signed papers whose meanings he could not fully hold, even as factions pressed his hand to smooth the ink of their designs. The palace itself became a theater of denial. Musicians played to conceal the rattle in the king's chest. Audiences were shortened so the courtiers would not watch him sway. And portraits continued to soften the jaw and brighten the eyes as if paint could reverse centuries. In private, physicians bickered over remedies that drained vitality in the name of balance, while the sick room smelled of hot wax camphor and a sweetness that hinted at decay. When the exorcists came, because of course they came, they brought reliquaries and muttered prayers in Latin, pinning hope to ritual, as though the soul could be coaxed into commanding the flesh. Some attendants swore the temperature dropped, others swore the king went briefly calm, but when the chanting ended, the symptoms remained. and a monk braver than his brethren whispered what none dared to publish. We cast out no demon, we wrestled with blood. In his last coherent hours, Charles reportedly asked whether God forgave a king for being weak, a question that struck the confessor like a blade, because it revealed what few understood beneath the deformity and delirium was a man ashamed of failing a country that had never allowed him to be anything but a symbol. And symbols cannot cry, cannot confess, cannot ask to be carried to the window to feel one last breath of winter air. Yet he asked, and they did. After the funeral, heavy brocade black crepe, the slow drum, and the thud of boots on stone, the city resumed its rhythm. But the court did not. It had become an engine built to serve a single task that it could not accomplish, produce an heir. Now it whirred uselessly, generating papers and accusations, and in that mechanical clatter one truth rang like iron. The dynasty had not been murdered by rivals, sorcerers, or saints. It had committed a meticulous ceremonial suicide, one marriage contract at a time. In the days immediately following Charles' death, Madrid became a city of locked doors and guarded whispers. Foreign envoys scurried between embassies, their cloaks snapping in the winter wind, each carrying messages coded so tightly that even the couriers didn't know whether they were delivering offers of peace or declarations of war. And inside the Alcazar, the counselors studied the king's will with the intensity of men searching for buried treasure, because every word could tip the balance of Europe. Charles's will named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor, a decision that landed like a thunderclap. For the French, it was the opening of a door they had long been pounding on. And for Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic, it was the sound of that same door slamming in their faces. Suddenly, the sick room of a dying king had become the spark for a continental blaze. As news spread, taverns and marketplaces buzzed with speculation. Would France and Spain unite under one crown? Would Austria retaliate? Some spoke of the prophecy that the bewitched king would be the last of his line, and they argued over whether the prophecy was fulfilled by his death or only by the collapse of the empire itself. In this swirl of superstition and strategy, even commoners felt the weight of dynastic fate pressing on their lives. Beyond Spain, Louis XIV wasted no time. He sent orders to prepare Philip for his journey to Madrid. Dressing the young man in finery meant to reassure the Spanish court that the new monarch would embody vigor where Charles had shown frailty. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the Habsburgs seethed, accusing France of plotting to dominate Europe through marriage, just as Spain had once done, and war councils met by candlelight to discuss troop movements along the borders. The War of the Spanish Succession was not yet declared, but it was already being fought in shadows. Spies slipped into ports to count ships. Merchants smuggled letters sewn into the hems of garments, and pamphlets painted lurid images of French or Austrian tyranny to rally public opinion. The air in Europe was as sharp as the moment before a blade falls, and everyone knew that once the armies moved, there would be no turning back. In Spain, Philip's arrival was a spectacle crafted to overwrite the memory of Charles's frailty. Trumpets blared, banners rippled, and the crowd roared approval. But beneath the cheers lingered an unease. This young Bourbon prince might restore strength, or he might simply bring the same curse under a different name. After all, Europe's thrones had long been tangled in the same web of blood and ambition that had birthed Charles. Old courtiers who had served under Charles II found themselves adrift. Some pledged loyalty to Philip, eager to secure their positions, while others retreated to their estates, muttering that no foreign-born king could understand the heart of Spain. In the salons of Madrid, the fashionable and the powerful debated whether the change in monarchs would bring reform or merely repaint the same crumbling walls. Meanwhile, the church moved quickly to shape the narrative of Charles's reign. Sermons framed him as a pious sufferer who had borne his afflictions with saintly patience, while carefully sidestepping the political disasters of his rule. Relics from his possessions, rosaries, prayer books, even scraps of his clothing began to circulate as tokens, as though proximity to the bewitched king might bring blessings rather than the decay he had embodied. Yet, in private, theologians and physicians debated the meaning of his life with a candor absent from the pulpit. The doctors spoke of genetic collapse, of how the royal bloodline had become a closed loop that starved itself of vitality, while the theologians argued whether such a fate was divine punishment or the natural outcome of human arrogance. In these hushed discussions, the king's life became a case study in how power can outlive its own purpose. And so even as cannons were hauled into position and diplomats sharpened their arguments, the memory of Charles II began to shift. To some, he was a warning that no empire, no matter how vast, could defy the laws of nature. To others, he remained a figure of Gothic fascination, a king whose body was both crown and coffin. And in this duality he lingered not in the marble of monuments, but in the whispered caution that every throne casts a shadow long enough to swallow itself. When war finally erupted in 1701, it spread like fire in dry grass, leaping from the Low Countries to Italy, from the Atlantic coast to the Danube. Soldiers marched under banners stitched with the faces of kings, but in the tavern songs and street broadsheets, it was still Charles II who haunted the verses, his image twisted into caricature by enemy printers who used his jaw, his slack gaze as proof that Spain had been weak too long. In Paris, pamphlets depicted Charles as a tragic martyr whose death had saved Spain by delivering it into Bourbon hands. In Vienna, they portrayed him as a bewitched puppet whose demise freed Europe from the threat of Spanish hegemony. Truth was irrelevant. The dead king had become a mask each side could wear to justify their cause, his body now a battlefield as hotly contested as any strip of land. For the common soldiers, the war's connection to the long-dead monarch was distant and abstract. What they knew was mud smoke and the shriek of cannonballs, the cold taste of metal when biting a cartridge open. Yet, even in the ranks, stories of the bewitched king circulated, told in the dim glow of campfires, as though his ghost still drifted over the killing fields, watching Europe spill its own blood in the name of his. Back in Spain, Philip Theffe sought to erase the memory of Charles's weakness, commissioning portraits of himself astride a warhorse armor, gleaming jaw firm. Yet, in private councils, his advisors studied the mistakes of the previous reign, vowing never to let court factionalism and genetic insularity choke the monarchy again, though such vows would be tested by the same temptations that had undone the Habsburgs. The war raged on for more than a decade, reshaping alliances and draining treasuries. Cities changed hands, fields were burned to stubble, and in the ruins the people cursed not just the living kings but the dead one, whose passing had set this chain in motion. In that sense, Charles II remained a living presence in absence, the silent witness named whenever blame was passed down the line. Historians in later centuries would sift through the medical reports, the letters, the propaganda, trying to untangle the man from the myth. Was Charles truly as incapable as the accounts claimed? Or had his enemies magnified every flaw to weaken the legitimacy of his reign? The answer was as murky as the candlelit corridors where those accounts were written, each scribe leaning toward the hand that paid him. One thing became clear. The physical evidence left no doubt that the Habsburg experiment in bloodline preservation had reached a catastrophic endpoint. The famous Habsburg jaw was more than an aesthetic quirk. It was the visible tip of a submerged iceberg of genetic fragility, one that manifested in everything from infertility to immune disorders, sealing Charles's fate before he ever wore a crown. Medical scholars have since traced his family tree with clinical precision, charting the loops of inbreeding that bound him more tightly than any chain. The map reads less like a genealogy and more like a slow tightening noose, each marriage knot pulling the rope closer until it finally snapped in 1700 with the last breath of the last Spanish Habsburg. In Spain's collective memory, Charles would occupy a strange space, not beloved, not entirely despised, but remembered with the uneasy fascination reserved for omens. His reign was a ghost story, retold to warn against arrogance, a reminder that the glitter of power could conceal the rot of its foundation, and that some curses are written not in spells but in signatures. Even today, visitors to Madrid who wander through the royal collections may pause before his portraits, noting the softened jawline the attempt to dignify features the painter dared not fully depict. They may leave thinking they have seen the face of a king, but in truth they have seen the mask of an empire at the moment it began to crumble from within, and behind that mask still whispers the name El Hechizado. By 1714, the War of the Spanish Succession finally staggered to its bloody conclusion with the Treaty of Utrecht, a patchwork of compromises stitched together over exhausted armies and drained treasuries. Spain retained its Bourbon king, but the empire's vast holdings were carved up ceded to Austria, Britain, and others in a diplomatic autopsy that mirrored the dissection of Charles II's own body years before. For the victors and the vanquished alike, the peace was bitter. No side had truly achieved its grand ambitions, and the people who had borne the weight of taxes, conscription, and famine found themselves living in kingdoms that had changed flags but not fortunes. Yet in royal courts, the narrative was already being polished. Charles's death had been the necessary purge, the clearing of diseased wood, so the tree of monarchy could grow anew. In Spain, Philip V set about reshaping the monarchy, adopting some French administrative practices to modernize governance, but old habits proved hard to kill. Court factions still schemed noble bloodlines, still guarded their purity, and whispers about the dangers of too close marriages were often drowned out by the allure of political convenience, as though the ghost of Charles's lineage still sat in council nodding approval. The Church, never missing an opportunity to frame history in moral terms, began presenting Charles II as a vessel of divine mystery, a man whose sufferings were proof of heavenly trials rather than human folly. Sermons recast his deformities as marks of endurance, subtly redirecting the lesson away from inbreeding and toward piety, ensuring that the political culpability of the Habsburg dynasty was softened for the faithful. But outside the pulpit, a different story thrived. Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century cited Charles as a cautionary example of what happens when power refuses to be tempered by science or reason, using his reign to argue for reforms in marriage practices, succession laws, and even early forms of genetic awareness, though these ideas would take centuries to fully influence royal behavior. In the centuries that followed, each retelling of Charles's life adjusted the balance between tragedy and horror. Some emphasized the political collapse, others dwelt on the morbid details of his autopsy, and still others found a strange sympathy in the image of a man born into a role he could neither refuse nor fulfill, trapped in a body that was both crown and cage. Modern historians, armed with genetic research, have largely confirmed what his contemporaries could only suspect, that Charles's extreme disabilities and infertility were the inevitable results of generations of inbreeding. The infamous Habsburg jaw was merely the most visible symptom of a deeper genetic bottleneck, compounded by the fact that his parents were uncle and niece. It is now estimated that more than half of Charles's genes were identical copies inherited from the same ancestors, a level of homozygosity so high it is rarely seen outside of isolated populations. In effect, his DNA was a hall of mirrors, reflecting the same traits again and again, until the distortions became debilitating. And yet, for all the science, there remains a folkloric shadow over his memory. In Spain, rural legends still speak of El Hechizado as a king whose weakness invited curses, whose spirit wanders the old halls of the Alcazar. In these tellings, the line between the supernatural and the biological blurs, because perhaps both serve the same moral that unchecked power inevitably turns inward and devours itself. Standing in the dim gallery of the Prado Museum, where his portraits hang beside those of his formidable ancestors, One can feel the arc of an empire in those painted eyes, the rise in golden armor, the plateau in velvet and lace, and finally the pale, tired gaze of a man who bore the full weight of that history in his bones. And in that gaze, silent but unyielding, lies the last warning of the last Spanish Habsburg. In the years after his death, the absence of Charles II became almost as tangible as his presence had been. Courtiers who once shuffled in his shadow now served new masters, yet spoke of him in lowered tones, as though invoking a name that carried both pity and omen, a reminder that thrones are as mortal as the bodies that sit upon them. His former chambers in the old Alcazar of Madrid stood eerily still, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and beeswax tapestries fading in the dim light. Visitors claimed to feel a chill along the spine when stepping inside, as if the king's suffering had imprinted itself into the very stones, an echo that refused to leave, even as the city outside moved on. Political pamphleteers continued to use his image for decades, each tailoring the memory to suit their cause. Some painted him as the final casualty of an outdated order, others as a holy sufferer whose reign marked the end of an age of faith. In either telling, the lesson was clear: the power of a dynasty can vanish with the frailty of a single heir. In foreign courts, his story was treated like a cautionary parable. Ambassadors warned young princes against marrying too close to kin, and historians, with the benefit of hindsight, drew his family tree as a warning diagram, a tight, tangled knot with nowhere left to grow proof that even empires could breed themselves into extinction. Artists of later centuries, unbound by the flattery demanded by his contemporaries, attempted more honest likenesses, portraits that hinted at the asymmetry of his face, the tired set of his eyes. These works did not mock him, but rather humanized him, revealing a man who might have lived quietly and anonymously had he not been born into a crown that became his burden. For geneticists in the modern era, Charles II has become a case study in the consequences of dynastic isolation. His DNA is examined not with scorn, but with clinical fascination, offering insights into the effects of extreme consanguinity, and in doing so, bridging the gap between history's judgment and science's explanation. Yet, beyond the science and politics, there lingers the human tragedy of a boy who never had the freedom to choose his own fate, of a man expected to embody the strength of an empire while barely able to stand beneath its weight. His reign was not marked by conquests or reforms, but by the slow unraveling of a dynasty that mistook bloodline purity for immortality. In the end, Charles II's greatest legacy may not be the war that followed his death or the lands lost in its wake, but the stark reminder that power without renewal leads only to collapse. His life, a fragile bridge between the grandeur of the past and the uncertainty of the future, showed that even the mightiest crowns are powerless against the truths written in flesh and bone. Today, historians still debate how much of his misfortune was destiny and how much was design. But whether one sees him as victim symbol or both, his story continues to haunt the halls of Spanish history, whispering through the corridors that no throne is immune to the laws of nature, no matter how gilded its seat. And so the legend of El Hechizado endures not merely as a tale of a bewitched king, but as the chronicle of a dynasty's slow, deliberate self-destruction. A reminder that the true curse was never cast by sorcerers or demons, but forged by the very hands that placed the crown upon his head, sealing his fate before he ever took his first breath.